Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireThesTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or $50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
So my name is Edin Hajdarpašić. I'm a historian. I currently work at Loyola University Chicago. I study the history of the modern Balkans, really 19th and 20th centuries, and have kind of interests in historical methodology, broader kind of questions about philosophy of history. And I guess one of the things that I've recently written is an article about the limitations of historians confronting politicians who spread deliberate lies about history. But I think it raises broader questions about how we deal with projects that deliberately step outside of essentially evidence-based ideas.
Yeah, I mean, so the essay is called "What Use is Fact-Checking Against Fact-Free Politics," and it was published on Public Seminar, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Walk us through at least some of the main ideas, if that's okay, just kind of ground us in this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's two things. There's like a short-term context that led me to write this piece, and then I think some longer-term things that I can maybe mention that I was thinking about in the background. So the short-term reason, and it's a substantial part of the article, the essay as well, is the political situation in Bosnia, which is currently in post-war Bosnia, basically in the last 10, 15 years, or maybe since the war that ended in 1995. And there has been various threats of secession in Bosnia for several years, off and on. But in November last year, November 2021, it came to a kind of a pretty stark crisis. Basically, in 2021, earlier that year, the top official who is in charge of implementing the Dayton Peace Accords in Bosnia imposed a new law banning genocide denial in the country. And it's a general ban, a blanket ban, but it was widely understood that the law would hit hard Milorad Dodik, who is this leader of the Republika Srpska entity that I can talk about in a bit. It's a separate entity that has its own history rooted in the 1990s war. And in an apparent escalation, Dodik is this Serbian nationalist who'd been making various threats about secession, referendums on secession before. But in last year, he took a couple of concrete steps to form separate state institutions and announced, that in the next 6 months that he would seek the formation of a separate military, that he passed some laws and, making sure that could happen. So obviously this is what set off the alarms, not only in Bosnia, but Western politicians got involved because the threat to create a new army would potentially provoke a new conflict. So ordinarily in Washington, D.C. or Brussels or the UN today, nobody really cares about Bosnia. I mean, I think it's just, at best, it's an afterthought. But in the fall of 2021, that's when suddenly you had these debates in the UN or in Brussels or in DC about what's next for Bosnia, or Bosnia on the brink. Like that article with that same headline has been reprinted like 100 times. And that's when a couple of news outlets reached out to me as a historian of the modern Balkans to kind of give an explainer about the crisis. And I think one of the requests specifically asked for like a deeper history that explains this conflict. And that's the sort of short term occasion for this essay. But let me just say very briefly that, like it's not just about last year. In the piece and in generally, most things that I try to do, I don't know how well I do them, but is to maybe ask broader questions. In this case, about the nature of denial, about the role of history in society. And I think that's especially important to ask those kind of bigger questions in various ways for us that come from, I mean, I think you should call it kind of like the periphery, from places like Syria or Bosnia or Sudan or Taiwan, and to insist on our stories as world stories, just as relevant as anywhere else in the world. Um, and I think in European and American media or academia, sometimes those kind of places from the periphery tend to pop up only in times of crisis. Like when there's this kind of crisis last year, when their histories are being spotlighted as different from Western ones, like they depart from the assumed norm and appear, different somehow, not on the same planes as Western or global ones. And I know something that like Syrian intellectuals like Yassin Hajj had talked in an earlier conversation about how American or Western European leftists are happy to lecture about Syria, but not engage with Syrians as equals. That have to say something about the world. They can say something, useful about the world. So generally, just kind of to step back and end my explanation about the piece, I try to raise issues that are rooted in Bosnia, but also ask bigger questions about history and politics that can be relevant to, America or Ukraine or Turkey. And I was happy to see that the essay was translated into Turkish. So my thanks to Edin Hajdarpašić for making that possible. And as a historian, I basically became concerned that historians were being expected in a time of crisis to either provide a deeper history uh, of crises that sometimes have shallow roots, or they're asked to like fact check what some statesman said about history. And that's what I wanted to rethink in this essay, and to kind of push back against this and say, what are the power relations in this setup?
Right. Thanks a lot for that. And the first thing comes to my mind is you mentioned on the brink. There are also many headlines of on the brink when it comes to Lebanon. It's become sort of a joke among folks I know, like friends of mine and stuff. Like, if this is on the brink, what's worse than that? Like how does it get worse than that? But because it's been on the brink for years and years and years now. But I guess the broader question, and this is I know the answer because I've read the essay, but listeners who haven't read it yet, I feel like maybe like a easy response would be like, well, what's wrong with um, fact checking and fact free politics? Isn't that how we challenge fact free politics, basically by providing
Mhm.
facts? I think there's still this idea in a lot of circles. I hover around a lot the climate activist world, and um, I think in recent years there's been more and more of an understanding that that's just not enough. It's not enough to tell people global warming is real. This is why it's happening. This is what we must do, etc., etc. There are like other things that also need to be taken into consideration, because for the most part, most people at least know the general gist of things. It's not
Mhm.
just a matter of they need to be presented with the information to therefore be empowered, although that's part of it. But why is it make the case basically as to why that is not enough, and how can it be? You mentioned it a bit, but let's get into it a bit more. But
Mhm.
how can it get used, in dishonest ways, basically? Let's put it that way.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that the last part that you said, I think is actually that we have to, is one of the starting points that I'm thinking about. And I will say that I think of that essay is not trying to present a solution. Maybe it is more about trying to pinpoint a problem. And that the problem that I see is that we have, let's say, in climate collapse problem that we're facing, when you have politicians that are in charge of making policies say, uh, we're just not sure about the science. There are different indications that maybe it's not as bad as scientists are saying, and maybe things are actually getting better in some ways. Uh, I think instead of trying to start with that statement and then fact check it, I think we have to step back and consider the context in which we have often scientists or historians whose role is often seen as apolitical or impartial, confronting a person that is explicitly political or has uh, a mandate, has the power to shape laws or pass decrees and do something about this. And the very fact that they are not identifying certain facts as real or based in evidence is the starting point for our conversation. Is to, when we see politicians saying that this is not happening, that climate change is not happening, that is a statement that is at this point uh, false, and we have to label that person as essentially having stepped outside the bounds of evidence-based discourse. We cannot start from that starting point, is basically my point, because that doesn't take into account the power dynamics that we confront either as scientists or as historians. And in my case, historians who deal with not climate change denial, but denial of genocide in Bosnia.
Yeah, let me take the climate change example a bit further, because this is something that I think now is better understood, but it's easy to forget where we were not that long ago, where you still had people going on TV, especially on American media, but also in European media, to essentially debate climate change, and often it would be like one scientist versus some random person, or that sort of thing. And it really, what this obfuscates is that it makes it's almost the argument being made is that if only we can debunk what they're saying, maybe then we can convince, if not them, but the people who are listening to them. And I'm not saying that's not part of it, but what that obfuscates rather kind of notoriously is the explicit role of, for example, the fossil fuel industry in promoting certain discourses that we know they knew. Now we know because it's been very well documented, but it was never about whether they personally knew or not. It was about they knew and they wanted to actively fight back against any efforts to uh, basically phase them out, because it was in their best interest not to do so. And with when it comes to Bosnia, obviously my reference, I will reference what I know most, which is Lebanon, and to slightly lesser extent Syria. It's always been situations where I explain what's happening in Lebanon, and I'm okay with doing that. That's part of what I do. But then some of the questions makes it sound as if what is happening in Lebanon is only happening there or could only happen there. And the sort of slightly funny thing is that I mostly work in English, and so I'm familiar with the US context enough, at least to commentate, and with the UK context. And often Americans or Brits don't see how weird their countries look like for too many other people. And it's the same thing. The main difference is that for the most part they get to tell their own stories because they have the resources for it, and they get to ignore to some extent how or what other people think of them. Like at the end of the
Mhm.
day, what the average European thinks of the average American doesn't matter that much in American politics.
Mhm.
But what the average American, when they ever do think about Lebanon, thinks about Lebanon, can actually impact Lebanon for one reason or another.
Mhm.
And among the many power differences that I can see, especially when I read your essay, That fact, it's not that the fact checking in of itself doesn't matter. It's more that there are different issues there as well. Another one, just to quickly add to that as well, is the pace of things. Like we now know, I think it's called the bullshit asymmetry principle. Like we know how this works. Like, fake news and bullshit and all of that spreads much faster than you have time to sit down and fact check and make sure that your fact checks is like well sourced and everything, because they don't have the same limitations. And so it becomes, in that sense, it becomes an infrastructural problem, like social media, etc., etc. So just wanted to add that, basically.
Yeah, that's like we could unpack that into like a couple of different questions, and maybe I'll just say one thing, and then we can return to this asymmetry between the periphery and places that are seen as exceptional or aberrations. I can talk about that separately, and it's something that I think also has to do with what I said about Yasin Haj Saleh had said earlier. But let me just first say, since you had mentioned climate change, honestly, I wasn't really, I didn't come with a set of notes. This is a kind of like an informal conversation, but I'm thinking about it. And it's not a new connection to make between, let's say, Holocaust denial and climate change denial. I remember years ago, George Monbiot had written an essay or something like this, or maybe I'm misremembering, but essentially making the argument that we have to label climate change deniers what they are, which is deniers and not skeptics, which is their preferred words, or critical thinkers, or all of these kind of euphemisms contrarians use to kind of camouflage this. But I will say this is one of the things that I keep thinking uh, about denial, more general. I think this comes through often in even in Holocaust denial, but I think it takes us. This is where I think climate change denial is different. If you think about Holocaust denial, the way like people like Deborah Lipstadt have written about it, it's a movement. It's not like a lone wolf kind of thing. There's clearly a coordinated effort. Um, it's acting out of a position of uh, feeling threatened. Like that it's in some sense defensive against the establishment of facts in this case. But what I keep thinking about is that the true aims of denial are often camouflaged. The tactics we know are familiar with, like it's to sow confusion, it's to say, well, it's a very complex issue that is murky. There's a lot of gray areas. There's a lot of disagreement, and it appears that all sides have something, a kernel of truth to them, right? So you can't really say what's wrong or right, or maybe everybody is a little bit right and a little bit wrong, and things like this. We know the tactics, but I think the objectives are often camouflaged. And I think this is what you had mentioned about the fossil fuel industry. When politicians lie about climate change, they don't say, that this is a message that is essentially sponsored to you by the fossil fuel industry. That's what I mean by camouflaged. And I think that's the same uh, in different ways with other forms of denial. I think where climate change is different is that, and I think one of the running threads, I guess, of this conversations is power relations. In the case of, let's say, Holocaust denial or genocide denial now in Bosnia, is that there is a power imbalance in which denialists are acting out of being uh, not so much cornered, but they feel that their ideology is threatened. I think climate change deniers also feel that their ideology is threatened, but I think this is where the power balance is different. They are often the ones who are in charge of states, in charge of corporations, in charge of massive, efforts to preserve uh, the current way that we are living and exploiting natural resources, so that um, it's not quite the same. I think I see a lot of similarities between uh, genocide denial and climate change denial, but I think in the realm of power relations, there is a slightly different dynamic there. I would just say that, and then we can talk about the other things that you had said also about Lebanon and its periphery, etc.
No, for sure. And I mean, and anyway, it links to the next question, which was about, or actually, let me backtrack a bit because there was this other question I want to ask first. When, let's say if you get let's say what was happening last year, and then you get a media inquiry and tell you, hey, as a historian, can you explain what's going on? Let's say you respond to that email and you tell them this is X, Y, and Z, this is what's going on. What usually happens after that? Like, is it they would take a quote that just fits within the piece anyway, or would they change the piece if they feel like the answer that you gave them is not what was fitting in the piece? Walk us through. It doesn't have to be a specific example, but walk us through why essentially, or what happens in that process of translation, if I want to put it that way, between a historian and a media outlet whose audience are not historians.
Yeah, that's a big problem in, I think, public history. And I think as a historian of the Balkans, I've had different experiences. Some, I have to say, very positive, working with media outlets or journalists. So it's not like I have a grudge. In fact, I have a lot of respect for investigative journalists, and I feel like historians have a lot to learn from them, and vice versa. But I have to say, kind of walk. You said walk us through. I guess some of the common assumptions that I run into as a historian of the Balkans is about the history of this region, and one is, I think, pretty straightforward. I think this is probably pretty familiar to maybe your listeners or anybody who knows anything a bit about the Balkans in sort of more critical academic setting. And I think that's kind of a variation on the Orientalist stereotype of the unchanging East. In the Balkan case, there's the assumption that uh, the Balkans have always been a place of division and conflict. And that's even the word Balkanization expresses that. And in line with that view, any conflict in Bosnia is assumed to be having deep roots or having being deep. And not to go back to that, since you mentioned that, headlines like Bosnia on the brink or Lebanon on the brink, you don't even have to say on the brink of what, because everyone knows it's on the brink of war or something. It's never like the brink of greatness or anything positive. So that's like one thing that you run into. That's an assumption. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight, uh, and I think this really gets into some parallels that or maybe overlaps is not so much parallels, but I think this notion of a long and continuous history partly matches what nationalists want to do with history. And in Bosnia, nationalists, especially, I think this is especially evident in Republika Srpska, but I think it's a wider problem. The nationalists insist on this notion that their group, and therefore their state, um, are the products of a long and deep history. That it starts off somewhere in antiquity, and even if your state is founded like 2 years ago, it's the product of 1,000 years or more, at least. So in my essay, I wanted to especially focus on that nationalist idea and its implications for the public life of history, especially how certain histories are erased and silenced, and how others are blown up into enormous proportions. And I think you see that in Republika Srpska, which is like a case study that I take. It's not doesn't represent all of Bosnia. It's really one half, less than one half of Bosnia territorially, but it's something that I wanted to zoom in on in this article.
Yeah, you say it's less than one half, and I remember recently I was looking at the map and I was surprised that it was that big. In my mind, I always pictured like it's this tiny enclave that, for various reasons, the Dayton Accord, they kind of, wanted to appease one of the nationalists or what have you. But it's actually a quite sizable proportion of like Bosnia. Um, I guess like for me, the Lebanon parallel there, and it is different. I mean, all contexts are different, but because sectarianism is the big buzzword, and sectarianism is or political confessionalism or what have you is is the way the Lebanese government operates, or at least one of the ways the Lebanese government operates. But arguably, it's not really the main way. The main way is so broad, or not so broad, but like so common around the world that it sometimes doesn't deserve a mention. So, for example, the main way the Lebanese government operates is through a capitalist framework, or the main way the Lebanese government operates is through a patriarchal framework. And it's such a common thing around the world that it doesn't deserve like special attention. So what we end up focusing on are the thing that makes it, have a different flavor, almost like, okay, it has these things in common, but there's this other thing about it. But what often gets erased, and common, like what's frequently erased, is that these sectarian parties, for example, that in theory are supposed to be opposed to one another, regularly make deals with one another and regularly build coalitions with one another, and the coalitions change and whatnot. And it's simply not sufficient to say, well, they did this because they are Shias, or they did this because they're Sunnis, or they did this because they're Maronites. But it's deeper than that. It's shallower than that. It's actually not much deeper. It's the interests align in a certain way, and they change every now and then. Blah blah blah. But that's a different story than just saying ancient hatreds and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I see some parallels in Bosnia with that as well. I think one of the things that's kind of said about Bosnia is that uh, the the end of the war with the Dayton Peace Accords froze the situation, and that this peace is like a frozen conflict. And I think it's not necessarily untrue. I think that there's elements of that are definitely true for even today, but especially I think in 1995 that's true. Um, but we're talking right now in 2022. It's a lot different, and I think calling Bosnia like a frozen conflict and assuming that it's the same as it was in the 1990s is wrong. Not only in terms of like the politicians, but I think more kind of like in terms of what you are talking about. This post-war period generated its own new patterns that didn't exist before the war. In socialist Yugoslavia, that didn't exist during the war. That really you can't assume to be an expression of like Serb or Croat or Bosniak outlook or mentality, but that are product of this very specific um, setup that was in Bosnia, took shape in the Dayton Peace Accords, and that establishes certain incentives for a kind of I don't want sectarian nationalist. I mean these are all hard to define concepts that in a short time, but that basically are incentivized in the way that the country is set up. And I do see that as one of the parallels between Lebanon and Bosnia.
Yeah, indeed. And obviously, I'll bring up the episode I did with Ida Hozic on this very topic, because we found a lot of parallels between Bosnia and Lebanon. And the idea of this episode isn't now, it's not just going to repeat some of their parallels and differences and whatnot, although I can do this probably for hours. But it's just interesting to me that we're still at a point where I have to explain to people, or I mean, not every people, but like often I have to explain the difference between, yes, of course, something is complicated, like Lebanon is complicated, like many countries, there are complexities to the situation, but these complexities are not necessarily that different from your own complexities. They have the details are different, but the overall patterns can be familiar, at least if not similar. At the same time, this doesn't mean that we will flatten everything and pretend that the same problems in the US are the same problems in Lebanon, because I think this gets to a point where we end up flattening even further and kind of cheapening
Mhm.
the conversation. But
Definitely.
yeah, it's just one of those things I have in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to you talk about that kind of brought up a couple of ideas in my mind, and I guess places like Bosnia or Lebanon or that aren't that I think often come up, as I said earlier, when there is a crisis, and that's when the attention of the media or academia or even politics, then suddenly whatever right wing, left wing publications kind of have to say something about it, and they fit it in. And I think Bosnia is kind of like a good place to think about that kind of trap of exceptionalism, which is, I think, the idea that things that happen in the periphery are somehow either derivatives of or aberrations from the Western norm. You know, and I think that's, to me, one of the things that I try to think about in this piece. Um, and I think it requires sort of setting some context for the 1990s. Um, and I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is, like, in 1992, let's say, the war in Bosnia broke out. And I think it was in the same year. I didn't look it up, but I know the essay came out in '89, but I think the book came out in 1992. Francis Fukuyama publishes his book, The End of History, which
Mm-hmm.
became a pretty pervasive 1990s view that history was always progressing toward greater freedom, universal human rights, all the goodness. And, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed without a massive war. Of course, there were conflicts, but it didn't engulf the world. Uh, the EU was expanding, unifying, et cetera, et cetera. And it's, looking back, it's kind of a pretty simplified, well, not so simplified, but it's kind of like a vulgar Hegelian narrative, complete with like a political teleology that culminates with Western values as enshrined in the EU and the US, uh, having these things, and the rest of the world trying to compete with them or trying to emulate them. And that was very popular in the 1990s. And I think it remained more or less intact in different ways up until really the rise of Trump and Brexit. That served as a very rude awakening that this is not the end of history that we were told. But let me just set back to the 1990s. That's when I was growing up. For a long time, this is, for me, growing up with the war in Bosnia, parallel to this narrative, it really made me question the positions from which you narrate certain things. It really made me wonder about vantage points in history, to wonder about perspectives, including my own perspective on history. It's kind of like, one of these things that it was very formative. It made me ask, who determines what is and what isn't the so-called main subject of historical narratives? Who determines what counts as zeitgeist, like the spirit of history, and what is supposedly, a less significant event or a process in world history? And what kind of theories or histories could we articulate from places that are relegated to the periphery? And to be honest, already, if you're sort of asking those kinds of questions, that puts you at odds with how much of, with large parts of Western academia and how they perceive places like Bosnia or Lebanon. Like, if you're in the periphery, the flow of knowledge and expertise is implicit, but it's also pretty clear. Like, you're supposed to flow, it's supposed, knowledge or whatever theory is supposed to flow from the West, and locals are going to somehow absorb it or be improved or enlightened by it. And I'm caricaturing only a little bit because I've seen it in Bosnia, especially, I think, in the first post-war decade, maybe less so today. But you see this, like, I can't tell you how many EU-sponsored seminars on reconciliations I've seen. My God, Joey, it's like it's like, here's the deputy mayor of Munster with a lecture. Why can't you Bosnians be friends? Or like, why can't you be more like France and Germany at the end of World War II? Or my favorite is like when, and everybody says this, like, I think Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, said this as well at some point about Bosnia. Don't argue over history, leave history to the historians. And, it's like, I don't like, we have it all figured out, and you locals, wherever you are, take notes and learn. And I think it's only with the rise of Trump and Brexit, and especially with Russia's now second war in Ukraine, that this self-confidence has been shaken. And, I think maybe people are saying, hey, our conversations don't need to be in this tutoring mode. God forbid we have something to learn from each other uh, in this way. So, uh, anyway, maybe that's not a direct way to answer your question, but it is something that I've been thinking about.
No, it is, and for me, I've been giving this example more and more because I feel it just says a lot. Like if we want to argue as to which event or among let's say an event that was extremely objectively impactful over, for lack of a better term, world history or world politics or whatever in the past decade or so, I would argue that the Syrian revolution is one of the major ones. And I can easily make the argument for it. I can mention the refugee crisis, which obviously galvanized a lot of far right reactionaries in Europe. I can think of the deal between Turkey and the EU, which in many ways changed the direction of where Turkey's own relationship with the EU could have been going elsewhere. I can think of the role of Iran. I can think of what's happening in Lebanon. I can think of later on the role of Russia, which in many ways precipitated what Russia would end up doing in Ukraine, which then in and of itself becomes this more or less recognized quote unquote world event, which it is. My argument isn't that this isn't a world event. My argument is that this other thing is also a world event. I mean, we should question also what world event even means.
Yeah.
But so my kind of my take with this is just that um, even though Syria objectively and maybe one can hope that like in 50 years or whatnot it ends up having the recognition it deserves, but whatever, that's not the concern now. In the present time, at least it's not my concern. um like objectively you can make the argument that here is why, and you give like 50 bullet points as to why the Syrian revolution has been extremely impactful on the world. At the same time, it is simply not treated as such, and what ends up happening is that these things end up always taking quote unquote the world, or I'm going to be specific here, taking Europe by surprise, for example. And we know this, like now we know that basically the EU's only real politics when it comes to most of the Middle East, and slightly exaggerating with this, but at least one of the most consistent ones, is just how to reduce refugee flow. And so because of that, and refugee flow, because as the assumption is that everyone will immediately want to go to the north, of course.
Hmm.
But the so what ends up happening is that the priority is no longer even pretending or paying lip service to democracy or to whatever, to human rights, but actually just quote unquote statecraft. And we're seeing this
Hmm.
now with Syria a lot. The priority isn't anything to do with Syrian rights, like the rights of Syrian or like the human rights of Syrians, but everything to do with quote unquote stability. And stability in Syria quite literally means gulags. Stability in Syria means death on an industrial scale, and bombings and torture and enforced disappearances and whatnot. But that doesn't matter as much on a quote unquote global scale, as long as it doesn't leave the border of Syria, or if it does leave the border of Syria, that it doesn't go too far away, i.e., it doesn't get too close to the West, and in this case, specifically Europe in this case. And so this is sort of the argument I sometimes make, and I feel like even while I'm making it, certain people will believe me, like certain people will agree, and other people will maybe pause for a few seconds or a few minutes, agree in theory, but at the end of the day, because it doesn't um, materially, not, that's not even the case, but because it doesn't matter to the to like discursively matter, or I don't know what's the term I'm looking for, but because it doesn't impact how we quote unquote, like people in Europe and or the US, whatever, end up talking about it or talking about themselves, more importantly, like the link between the Syrian revolution and Brexit, or the link between Syrian revolution and the rise of the far right. That's not just, oh, the brown people came over and the racists started getting scared, therefore we need to push away the brown people in order for the racists to be less scared, because that's as good as it gets with the discourse these days. But yeah.
Yeah, man, that's not to kind of like repeat what you said about Syria, because I think I totally agree with it. But I think for me, one of the things thinking about that is that really came through, uh, and it took a long time for me to realize this. Really, in graduate school, reading more anthropologists than historians, to be honest. And it has to do with narrative, about how we tell stories about supposedly the history of the world, and also which entails not just narrative strategies, but also your own position, your own vantage point from which you tell histories. And I think that's not necessarily that there isn't like one correct narrative, there isn't one correct position. What I find disturbing is this idea that we all are supposed to assume this essentially Eurocentric worldview, and that is already kind of preformed for you. That once you absorb it, once you are educated into it, and sort of really deeply accept it, that the world is supposed to start making sense to you. It doesn't, and I think for me, growing up with the Bosnian War really me aware of like how, even though it was a big event for Europe especially, but for the U.S. for a brief time in the middle of the 1990s as well, with the 1995 and 1999. But I think it quickly kind of the focus moves on to something else, the next crisis or whatever, and the narrative is uninterrupted. Like your periphery is absorbed into this larger narrative of the increasing of human rights around the globe. This kind of, as I said, like a Volker Hegelian end of history kind of narrative that really predominated in the 1990s, and only recently has, I think, been kind of crashed wide open. And I think there's now a search for some other narrative to tell. And I think it's interesting to think through that in light of Syria, in light of forgotten places like Bosnia as well. And I would again plug what you mentioned, the conversation with Aida Hozic. I think that was really brilliant. So maybe I'll just stop there. Like, the Bosnia is not the, my effort in trying to think about these places is really to see and question from what perspectives we tell history. As a historian, I'm interested in that question, but I think it's broader than that, is how we see the world, really. And to question our own assumptions and see where they come from, because they all have histories that are embedded, and we don't need to reject them. We don't need to a priori think that they are negative, positive, anything, but we do have to think critically, and we have to think for ourselves about them. And I guess that's kind of like the way I approach it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks a lot for that answer as well. I obviously completely agree. And one thing that, well, it is related anyway. I mean, everything we're talking about is related anyway. But I'm interested about two things, and I'll start with like the first question, um, which is like, we now know from many examples, and I think more people are aware of this if, for example, they are familiar with the kind of like the anti-trans, like the transphobic discourses that we're now seeing popping up in the US, and at such a speed it's happening. And we can, maybe, as part of my hope, that our memory isn't too short, that we can remember that not that long ago they were talking the same kind of online, not necessarily just online, but especially online kind of ecosystems or media systems, essentially bubbles of right wing and far right and whatnot. They were using very similar discourses against the so-called caravans coming from Latin America and Muslims in general, maybe before that and after that and during that. It's kind of an ongoing thing, and different groups of people that are, for the most part, minorities in a certain context. And the term minority is problematic, but I'm just using it as a shorthand here. Um, we kind of, I'm hoping that more people understand that there's a direct connection between um, dehumanizing a group of people, and at this end, so that's one aspect of it, and also that it is linked to treating the people, dehumanizing them, or treating the quote unquote arguments being made by those dehumanizing them as if it is a position worthy of, to some extent, understanding, or even respect to some other extent, depending on the situation. So the example I'm thinking of is when I think of we saw it a bit with Russia and Ukraine, right? I mean, I think the brutality of the invasion was to such an extreme extent that the kind of Putinist, or let's say light people who would not call themselves pro-Putin but would say things like "I don't like Putin, but," and so after that they follow up with the apologia. Those folks, I feel, did not get the platform they probably would have had otherwise, but they're not too far away. And I think that the discourse that they would be, and I'll explain why I made the jump between, like, transphobia and there and in the US and Putin in Ukraine. What I'm trying to say with all of this, so I don't ramble too much, is that there is a tendency within, I'm going to be very vague about this, but within like politics, within media in general, to treat those with a very clear intent to do harm as uh, as deserving of equal attention span, or understanding, not attention, understanding, as those that they are harming. And I feel there is something to be said there, and I kind of try to make the link a bit clunkily, but there is a link between this desire or this need to appease, to basically don't let's not rock the boat too much. Like, let's hope that we can wish Putin away, basically, which is, I think, half of the EU's policy at this point.
Yeah.
you know those tendencies, or let's hope that if we calm down the transphobes, like if we go their ways somehow, maybe maybe we don't say transphobia is good, but maybe we start understanding, oh well, I get their position or whatnot. Maybe by doing that we calm them down, despite the fact that time and time again we see that what it actually does is just it solidifies their position. It makes them more extreme in
Mhm.
many ways.
Absolutely. I think, each of those issues to me, just kind of stepping back and thinking about it, and I guess, maybe too many of my examples come from history, but I do think about uh, what you said, as having important historical, not only precedents, but I think what you're pointing to is this logic of, on the one hand, wishing things away. I wish that it wasn't, that Putin didn't invade in Ukraine, or maybe he's more reasonable than we give him credit for, or maybe there's we haven't really thought about it from his perspective, like truly, truly, and same with transphobes and anti-trans discourses. But I think the kind of underlying logic there often tends to be, and I think you're right to call it essentially a variant on appeasement, because I think in the interwar period you had, obviously a huge surge of anti-Semitism that was vehement, violent, and ubiquitous. But then you also had, if you study the discourses of the time, and obviously I didn't come prepared with notes. I do have it somewhere. I wish I could remember who said it, but one of the French politicians at the time basically said, uh, his platform was like, we don't need this kind of virulent Nazi kind of anti-Semitism. What we really need is a more moderate kind of anti-Semitism that is suited to French circumstances. And the history of our nation is not the same as the German. But this is the kind of, it's not just a slippery slope, but it's this idea that you can compromise with an extreme position, that is truly outside the bounds of what should be acceptable discourse. That, to deny someone's existence, or um, to really wish harm on them, or to organize violence against them, those are not positions that you can compromise with. Like, well, let's just hurt them a little bit. Like, how about that? Do you know what I mean? Like, I guess to me that's the underlying logic of appeasement. And let me just,
Hmm.
since we have this essay on Bosnia in the background as an occasion for our freewheeling conversation here, but I do think that I see it in Bosnia. This kind of, um, you termed it, I think, wishing things away, and I definitely see this in Bosnia, Joey. It's like, you have this Republika Srpska entity. I can talk about it more. now. But if you, yeah, maybe it is a good time to kind of just very briefly talk about
Yeah,
it.
yeah, go for it.
Okay, so like, I know it feels like jumping around, but basically, we have this political entity, and it's a place that has a really recent history. It's called Republika Srpska, or the, you know, uh, Republic of Srpska. It's a very awkward translation in English. It doesn't really exist. That's how it's called in the Dayton Agreement as well. It's created in 1992 at the beginning of the war in Bosnia by Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. So these are hardline Bosnian Serb nationalists who seized on Yugoslavia's dissolution as their chance to establish an ethnically pure nation state. And they were backed by Slobodan Milosevic and also by the remnants of the Yugoslav National Army. And they went on, these founders of Republika Srpska, to pursue their aim of creating basically a ethnically pure statelet by targeting non-Serbs, and that meant primarily Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims and Croats in the areas that they controlled. And that was really substantial. At some point, it was like 70% of Bosnia was controlled by the Serbian army. And in the end, as you mentioned, uh, the Republika Srpska survived, but the founders of Republika Srpska were convicted. So what happened in 1995 is the Dayton Agreement comes along. Uh, Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic are indicted. They're later, this long story about them, but they're indicted, go into hiding. They're arrested eventually and convicted in The Hague uh, beyond reasonable doubt on charges and retried, appealed on charges of crimes against humanity and genocide. And that's not a history that I kind of made up. Like, if you read the transcripts, if you read the thousands of pages assembled by the ICTY, that's what happened with Republika Srpska. There is no uh, other way to narrate its founding and its existence other than creation through genocide and crimes against humanity. And again, this, I emphasize this. This is, the war in Bosnia is bigger than this. I'm only talking about the Republika Srpska. But if you talk about Republika Srpska as an entity, this is the facts that we're dealing with. And of course, there were other things that went on in the 1990s. But if we're talking about this place, its leaders were convicted, but their creation, Republika Srpska, was to remain. And it's given this status of basically autonomous entity. It's 49% of the territory of Bosnia within the independent state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the other entity is called Federation, composed of federated cantons. And that's where we get to the situation where, like, we have this entity that's led by Milorad Dodik, who's like this, blustery populist politician who portrays himself as the guardian of this wartime legacy. And even though initially he emerged as a liberal alternative to Karadzic, um, Dodik became really adamant, and he kind of figured out that his big card is to push Republika Srpska further in this like hardline nationalist direction by denying that it was founded on genocide, denying that the founders of Republika Srpska, Karadzic, Mladic, Plavšić, all those people, that they committed genocide, and claiming eventually that the entity will soon have its own army, treasury, and other institutions. And he can only get away with that because he has the support from, well, first of all, Putin in Russia, but more importantly, in the sort of neighborhoods of Bosnia and in the region, he gets support from Vucic, Aleksandar Vucic, this autocrat in Serbia, and from also, and this I think really flies under the radar, from people like Viktor Orban in Hungary within the EU. What I mean to say is that Republika Srpska has people who make excuses for it within and support it within the EU. Orban is probably the most obvious one, but there are others. So let me just go back to what you had earlier said. I've seen this like a lot among academics, like who, and I mentioned this earlier, like who come, Western academics who will come to Bosnia and be like, but why can't you all reconcile? Why can't Bosnia move beyond its wartime past. Uh, and it's almost like wishing that the genocide didn't happen and that Republika Srpska wasn't founded on genocide. And you know what? I wish it wasn't either, but it was. Like, we just have to kind of confront this. And wishful thinking, like, what if Dodik isn't really a hardline nationalist? What if we kind of treat him with kid gloves, and give in to some of his demands, because all sides have something wrong and something right with them, and we can just compromise. And I think, to me, that's this kind of like uh, outlandish, slippery logic, because here we're dealing with a person who has decided uh, full well. I mean, he came out earlier, like in 2007, and said, we know that genocide in Srebrenica happened, and then turned around and said, like, no, it didn't happen. Uh, and the only reason why he did that is because he uh, realized that that's his ticket to this kind of like whipping up this particular fear, and kind of populist outrage that keeps him in power. So that it's really staked out a position that's detached at this point uh, from evidence, from facts, from both in terms of the past, but also like clearly that it's heading in a direction where like this is going to be an entity that's really unhinged. I mean, um, it's not a pretty picture, and pretending that it's otherwise, like that it's more moderate, or maybe things weren't so bad in the 1990s. But what if you guys, all of you, just agreed not to talk about it when you have like this extremist in the room who is the president of this entity screaming otherwise? I think that's not the most appropriate response. I mean, it's obviously not an appropriate response.
And this sort of brings me to the other thing that, again, the I mentioned Syria before, that if someone wanted to see that this could lead to bigger things and it's going to affect the only places that matter to world politics, which is like Europe and the US or whatever, you could have already reached that conclusion in 2011, if not maybe 2012. But it just didn't matter discursively. And here, what I see, and this is kind of like my just observer status of just following a number of Bosnians online and kind of seeing certain things and doing my own research or what have you. But I'm sort of seeing is something similar happening, in the sense that the EU tends to be, and I'm just focusing on the EU because I'm based in Europe, not that I think is the only thing that matters, but has a tendency of not dealing with a reality until the reality sort of just is too big to handle. And then when it does handle, as you see, when it does happen, as you see with Russia and Ukraine, they still find ways, many of them anyway, still find ways to kind of push it away and wish it away.
Mm-hmm.
My so the transition I wanted to make here is that you mentioned guardian, like this is how Dodik describes himself, like he's the guardian of whatever Serbian ultranationalism, whatever. And the whole being a guardian of something is something I've been quite interested by in the past few years, for all the wrong reasons. Namely that, like, obviously this is how Orban describes the guardian of Christian Europe, right? And in what kind of concerns me isn't that
Mm.
this is how someone who is obviously right wing or far right talks. What concerns me is that it is not that different from, I mean, it is different. There is a difference. I'm not gonna say it's the same, because I feel like that would also be flattening certain differences, but it's not as different as it should be from what someone like Ursula von der Leyen how she talks about, how she has talked about non-white migrants and non-white refugees. That, for example, now it's kind of a blip in people's memories because it happened around the same time as COVID was becoming more and more prominent in the news. But in early 2020, she described Greece pushing away migrants and refugees from Turkey because Turkey, quote unquote, opened the gates, which is another thing that we can talk about. Like, this is how Turkey does things, but it's not that important here. Um, she described Greece doing that as aspida, like Greece was being the shield of Europe, is how she described it. And there is this idea, like, you're always protecting the fortress, effectively. That it's a metaphor of a fortress. You're always protecting it from the invaders. And this is something that's extremely common in I do cultural studies, and so I look, I watch movies and I pretend that I'm studying them. But it's something that's very common in movies and series and anime, and Attack of the
Mm,
Titans is a popular one where they're quite literally a fortress, and you have the invading whatever Titans, I guess they would be called,
mm,
coming. This metaphor, this idea, or World War Z, for example, the zombies coming in, always this foreigner, this other, is always otherized. Like this is a process.
mm,
And the awkward segue between that and I think more recent events is that I think we've already gotten to the point where the things that in the past would be sort of difficult to ignore are now being ignored, as in they have become whitewashed and they have become normalized. And what worries me is obviously that this is never the final step of, not that there's a linear framework to these things, but like more or less that it's heading in a certain direction. What worries me is that it's heading in a certain direction, and sort of feels that not that many people are aware that it's heading in a certain direction, but we're not the ones who are driving the bus. Like we're not the ones who
mm.
are, but we are on the
Right,
bus, so we don't have a choice. And I'm thinking of we're recording this on the 18th of July, and like a couple of weeks ago there was the massacre in no end of June. There was a massacre in Melilla, northern, it's in a Spanish enclave in effectively northern Morocco, of like I think 37 people were killed by the border guards. And this has, it's a blip in the news. It's barely
right,
something that now counts as newsworthy. And I feel like this normalization has been coming. It's been happening for a
mm,
long time now, and it does play to what we're talking. It does, I mean, play into what we're talking about now, because obviously, even though they wouldn't want to say this out loud, there is a lot of Islamophobia that's normalized and just taken for granted when discourses around Bosnia, when Bosnia is even in the news in the first place, or even talked about in the first place. This is part of the underlying narrative that ultimately we, quote unquote, have more in common with the Dodic or the Serbian dude whose name I'm forgetting, or Putin or what have you, than we do with the average Bosnian Muslim, or that we do with the average Turk or the average Syrian or the average what have you. And when we get to that point, I feel like arguably we're already at that point. But if we get at that point even more, explicitly, I feel like this is where the dark underbelly of European politics starts coming back
yeah,
again.
yeah, man. Yeah, that's yeah. I think part of what I mean, I have a sort of a lot of things that I could say. I'm trying to refocus on one part of it. I guess it goes back to this idea of guarding or defending Europe, and I think or sometimes explicitly Christian Europe, especially like people like Dodik talk about that very explicitly, or Orban for that matter. So what I think the linkage that you made there is really important is that it's not just leaders of Serbia and Russia that support Dodik and similar hardline nationalists in Croatia or among the Bosnian Croats. And one of the reasons they don't get immediately sort of discredited or condemned in Europe is because on some level, the European project is happy to say like, oh, this is, you stepped out of bounds when you denied the genocide in Srebrenica. But the pushbacks that are happening along the Croatian border, yeah, we're just going to like turn a blind eye on that. And in all these ways, that in other ways in which Dodik expresses or Croat nationalists express not just Islamophobia, but this extremist anti-refugee discourse, really that there's a kind of space in which the European discourse and silence it acts as a permission to take that anti-refugee rhetoric further and to enact violence. I mean, just yesterday, one of the Serbian prime ministers, Volin, he literally said things like, Serbia is not a parking lot for and I forget like how he said for scum, or like Asian or African scum, or like it's like really crazy extremist ideas. And this is like a minister in the Serbian government who paraded before cameras, like before people that are on the ground with their hands on their heads, with refugees. So what I'm trying to say, just kind of, since you brought up Melilla and you know all of this context around the Mediterranean, and of course the Balkan migrant route is inseparable from that as well. These are pretty brutal regimes, honestly, that um, aim to keep out. And I don't think it's just Islamophobia. There's a long history there that I can talk about in a moment, but it's really kind of become racialized to keep, in this current moment, black and brown people out of Europe. That's like Fortress Europe. That's the similarity. But the language is broader, and it can, once you sort of establish this idea of defending Europe, it's a very powerful one. It's also a very old one, even though it doesn't mean the same things today as it did 50 years ago, or as it did, whatever, 300 years ago. It meant something different. But the fact that it is a cliche, so to speak, uh, means that it's a notion that you can graft onto uh, some new ideas. That basically you take these earlier ideas of protecting Europe and you can graft them, you can evolve them, you can make them into something new. And here, what I'm thinking about is, I had taught this recently, or I guess last year, maybe not so recent, but anyway, um, I reread the speech that Slobodan Milosevic gave in 1989 for the Battle of Kosovo. It was the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, which took place in 1389, when the Ottoman and the Serbian armies fought in what was essentially a stalemate. But long story short is that it becomes this defining moment that is later seen as the subjugation of the beginning of the end of the Serbian kingdom and of all the sort of Balkan peoples implicitly uh, from there. And in 1989, Milosevic comes to Kosovo, and a million people gather. Communism is crumbling. He's clearly on the cusp of something new, and he makes this speech. It's an interesting speech, but at the end of it, he explicitly invokes defending Europe in 1989. And he says something like, Serbia didn't just defend itself against the Ottomans/Turks or whatever. Serbia also was defending Europe and its religion and its culture. So, and then he says, like, in the past there were battles, so there may be battles for us in the future. And this idea of defending Europe was really popular among people like Milosevic or Karadzic and the whole Republika Srpska leadership. They often, and in Croatia too, it's huge. They often cited the idea of defending Europe in the 1990s. And that had a really far resonance in the 1990s. I don't think that it's not something that I think is really understudied. How many far right figures at that time um, realized that there is an affinity between what they're saying in places like France or England is being enacted in a much more brutal way, by Karadzic and Milosevic, and they can condemn them for saying that, for doing that, and say, like, these people are too extreme, they're violent, they're really Balkan, they're not really European, but let's not condemn them entirely because they're still a part of our Christian European world. And when I say this, this is not like a hyperbole. Karadzic, when he was charged with genocide in 1985, he went to hiding and remained in hiding until, like, I forget, 2008, 2011. I can't remember at the moment. And in that period, Jean-Marie Le Pen in the late 1990s sought out Radovan Karadzic and met with him while he was sought by the Interpol. And that only came out afterwards, like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like this. And the thing that they had in common, like, why is Le Pen, the father of Marine Le Pen, why is he having this meeting with a wanted criminal? Well, it's this, they can't say it. This is what I mean about, like, camouflaging your true, that they can't say it, but what they have in common is this idea of defending Europe against Muslims. And even during the war, one French diplomat said, I literally, I don't remember the exact quote, but it was like in an article in the New Yorker, we worry more about Muslims than about the Serbs. And that's the idea, like that they have in common is and enacted. And Jean Baudrillard wrote, the author of Simulation and Simulacra. He wrote a great essay in the 1990s about that affinity. I wish maybe we can put it in the links in the description somewhere. Basically, about how Milosevic's Serbia is doing the dirty work of defending Europe, and they might get a slap on their hands, but there's like an underlying affinity that Europe shares with extremist nationalists. And I think a critical history of this idea from the 1990s to the present kind of still remains to be written.
It made me think of there's a book, I haven't read it, but the title of that book is a common phrase that I've come across a number of times in, like, I don't know if it's necessarily in Holocaust studies, but let's say in Jewish spaces that I tend to frequent as well from time to time, which is like people love dead Jews. And in the sense that in Europe, I would argue that they're fine, for example, for with commemorating the Srebrenica genocide. They're okay with saying, well, this thing that happened 20 years ago, that massacred a number of Muslims, that's a bad thing. But they're only fine with it because these Muslims were already murdered. As in these 8,000 Muslims that were murdered in Srebrenica, for those who don't know, in July 1995, are dead already. They're no longer a question, quote unquote, on us in Europe. They're no longer, their bodies are underground. They're no longer, they can be described. And I was looking up, by the way, what you were talking about, the Serbian minister. And yes, he's literally standing in front of migrants and refugees. And he said, like, Serbia, as you said, Serbia is not a parking lot for Asian scum. That was his sentence, and that's at the Serbian Hungarian border, so technically the
Yeah.
EU border.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that
I mean, he could be wearing a Frontex uniform,
exactly,
but yeah. Anyway,
he
yeah.
could be
It's
wearing a Frontex uniform, and he could be wearing an in swastika. And the goal, or the and I don't mean this to be provocative. I think quite literally, it would look the same. The aesthetics are almost exactly the same. Um, and that sentence, the one I mentioned before, people love their Jews, it's the sense that in Europe, especially, but also in the US, but especially in Europe, there isn't a huge problem with discussing the Holocaust as long as you keep it in the past tense, as long as you
Mhm.
talk about it as something that happened in the past that could never happen ever again. Nothing like that could ever happen ever again in Europe, because we've learned our lesson, because we've said never again a billion times, etc., etc. And as long as we repeat it like a mantra, it becomes true. As long as we repeat like a mantra, it's never going to happen again. And yet now, of course, I mean, I would never compare anything to the Holocaust because it's on a scale that's virtually unheard of. But there are
Mhm.
elements of this that I would argue are essentially fascistic. Like, again, the Melilla massacre, the what you just mentioned, the I mean, effectively a selfie. He almost took a selfie in front of those people that are all like, how do I say this, like they have their head between their knees, kind of thing, lying on the ground, etc., etc. um, for me, this isn't coming from a context in which never again is taken seriously, like if in which we've actually said never
Yeah.
again. Like, for me, this is, again, it's a mantra that we repeat as a way of not having to do the work that we have to do, basically.
Mhm.
um, I guess it's sort of a wrapping up ish before we get into the book section. You mentioned Hannah Arendt, and I really think in the essay, I mean, and I really think that she is, and maybe it's kind of unfair as a last question because it's such a big topic, but we'll try our best.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's best.
she has this. Well, yeah, there's a sentence that you mentioned, I think, which is, I'm just going to quote it. Faced with powerful forces that are rewriting the past, historians should rethink their assumptions and pose new questions about the relationship between power and their discipline. So that's kind of like what we started with this, and it's kind of the underlying theme of this conversation. But as a way of wrapping up this conversation, again, can you discuss how Hannah Arendt's work, and with all of the critiques that also can be made forward, but whatever, like how which can she help us, or people like her help us understand things that the media and politicians and others still don't quite understand, and I'm saying the media, I mean, I'm just being broad on purpose, but like, lots of folks still don't understand when it comes to the relationship between power and yeah, what we're already talking about basically.
Yeah. Uh, let me just think for a second about there you. Not, I don't want to go back to exactly what you had said earlier, because I think I would say too much about that commemorative aspect, but maybe just to refocus on Hannah Arendt. Uh, for this essay that I wrote, I found it really uh, useful to think with her up to a point. Uh, Obviously, she's always a brilliant thinker, and her essay that really was relevant to this essay that I was thinking of is "Lying in Politics." It's a seminal essay. I had read it in grad school, and then when Trump came along, it kind of enjoyed a brief resurgence where people were constantly citing it, and she's incredibly uh, insightful about uh, talking about how authoritarian and totalitarian regimes have the ability to detach themselves from truth and invent a whole, that lying in politics becomes their entire, uh, uh, raison d'etre, like it's this entire platform on which their entire world is constructed, right? And how facts are, but what I find super interesting, people do tend to quote, and especially I think under this post-Trump, post-truth era, she's given like this kind of Arendt is given kind of this pessimistic uh, gloss, like how hard it is to fight against totalitarian regimes and lying in lying politicians and stuff like this. But what I found interesting when I reread it for this piece, and I reread a couple of other things as well, is how she says actually facts are a lot more resilient. And I think this is really underappreciated. How, despite the amount of lying, and in fact, the fact of having to invent an alternative world in which Srebrenica didn't happen, right? Or in which the Holocaust, or in which the Armenian genocide didn't happen, right? That's like a total fantasy unhinged from facts. But that facts have, even in a completely controlled environment, have a strange resilience and a flexibility that allows them to be reasserted, and reestablished. So that it's actually a battlefield in which we are partaking, if you do care about these issues, that it is a field of struggle. So to me, that was actually a really important part of what she was saying. Um, and it is this notion of struggle, I think, ultimately, is that we are engaged in a struggle, and that it's not issues that are settled. I think this is one mistake that people make a lot about discourses of denial, especially, that they assume that because um, facts about the Holocaust, facts about the Armenian genocide have been so painstakingly established, that we don't have to worry about denial, or that it's a settled issue. I think that gets it wrong. I think we have to think about how pervasive attempts to relativize and falsify history are, how we are engaged in a struggle in which we have to be alert to these strategies of relativization, in which, and I think this goes back to your earlier point, uh, well-meaning intentions of compromise with denialist positions actually allow them more of a platform and dilute our struggle to establish more dignity and a more justice in this, profoundly flawed world. And the last thing that I would say, and I think this is, I guess, really more as a historian that I'm speaking about, and uh, and I know that this is, speaking to probably an audience that is very diverse, and uh, one thing that I found interesting about Arendt is that she makes this comparison implicitly between historians and politicians, in the sense that she distrusts them or has an air of suspicion about them because they deal with human affairs and because they're tempted to legitimize their projects, right? And historians are constantly being enlisted to legitimize political projects in Republika Srpska, in any number of places in the United States currently, with all these laws banning so-called divisive concepts, etc. But that she has this sort of like air of suspicion about historians, and she almost sees them as uh, a last resort of people who, let's say you falsify history, you rewrite the history of the Holodomor and it didn't happen, or that it was, whatever deaths were accidental in Ukraine and that Stalin had nothing to do with it. And that she wants historians at that point to step in with facts, right? That no, we do have facts that say otherwise, but she doesn't see them as having anything else to say beyond that. And because this gets into this kind of polemical, political world, and that's where this distrust comes in. And I think that this is, maybe uh, something that Arendt didn't want to really rethink, because it would call into it would call into question so many of her other assumptions, which is that history, um, it does not function as an impartial field ever. And I think that we have to start with different set of questions about not just narrative, but about power, and the power to tell stories and the power to omit certain things, to erase history. And I think, to me, that's where, and I guess maybe this is shifting into the book section. This is really something that I learned much more, not from Hannah Arendt, but from uh, an anthropologist, Jean-Rolph Trouillot, who wrote a book called Silencing the Past, in which he really grappled with these issues that are fundamentally, he thinks about history. And yes, of course, a lot of it is epistemological. How do we know what we know in relating to knowledge and production of knowledge? But he, I think, to me, gets to the bottom, to the sort of bedrock of the issue, which isn't just epistemological, as important as it is. It's fundamentally a problem of power, and of power relations that are at work at every step in the production of historical knowledge, from the production of sources to the narration of what we are told is history, right? And being aware of that makes you think about history much more as a field of struggle than as a settled reservoir of facts. I guess that's kind of like what I thought about in the background of this piece. Maybe if I didn't express it quite this way when I wrote it.
No, you did, and thanks as well for expanding on this. Well, I mean, as with a lot of these episodes, I can definitely turn these into like 7 hour seminars, but difficult on a podcast format. So I guess to kind of wrap up, I usually ask all guests to recommend 3 books, or honestly, people often cheat and say 5 and 2, and sometimes it's a movie in there, so it doesn't really matter. But what are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners, and like why those 3?
So, since I mentioned Trouillot, maybe I'll just go with that. Jean-Rolph Trouillot is really the first book that I would mention. It's a book that's really about Haiti. It's about the history of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, but it's much more than that as well, because it's methodological in approach and anthropological, sort of in its awareness of positions. It's about how historians can grapple with histories that have been silenced in various ways, from the sources that we use to write history to grand narratives that tend to reproduce themselves, including the omissions and silences within them. So, in short, for me, that was like a book that really changed how I think about history, and I think it kind of throws open this wide question about what is history. It's not just about democratizing, which is like buzzwords, like let's democratize history. I don't know what does that mean, but I think Trouillot really thinks through it, and history is not just about history books or about people who write them. Um, History is a much bigger field of social relations and political relations and power relations that embody themselves in everything from architecture to artifacts and so on. And that you learn about constantly about history outside of the academia as well. So huge book, hugely recommended. I guess second book that I would recommend, speaking of Bosnian things, that we have been talking about. Um, so I would say that there's a book that's going to be called, I think, coming out with University of Missouri Press. I happen to have read it. It's a collection of essays or chapters called Bosnian Studies, um, that that is going to really compile a huge array of different views. It's edited by Dzeneta, Karabegovic, and Adna Karamehic-Oates. But there are, I think, a dozen or so, or maybe more, like given the co-authors, uh, uh, authors within the book. So, but in any case, Dzeneta Karabegovic and Adna Karamehic-Oates are the editors of this collection that I find really inspiring, because this is a new generation of Bosnian scholars, most of them in diaspora, or not just in Bosnia, but having been dispersed by the war and by the post-war migrations, and people leaving Bosnia, but also returning there, having to think about this place on the periphery in, I think, a much wider way than it would have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. So I think it actually taps into a lot of things that deal with memory, that deal with diaspora studies, that deal with post-genocide and post-conflict societies, with really often just sometimes meaning like things like, what does home and abroad mean when you think about places like Bosnia or Beirut, places that are marked by these huge waves of migration. So that's like the second book. And third book, again, something that hasn't come out yet or isn't out yet, but I think it will be within 6 months or a year or so. It's by Larisa Jasarevic, who is an anthropologist now working in Bosnia. She is, and I think actually this, now that I think about it, this would like to really interest you, Joey, and maybe your listeners as well, given the kind of, I think, affinities with environmental and solar punk and other issues. And her book is going to be, and it's a book, but it's also a documentary or a film that she has made. I've seen parts of it, and I talked with her this summer, so I sort of feel relatively up to date on it. And I think it's called Beekeeping in the End Times. And it's really a kind of on the ground look, or in Bosnia, situated in a very concrete terrain, but it's beekeeping and the disappearance of bees in a place that's already undergoing now, having, in a sense, having the world end once with the war in the 1990s, and then recover, but having to face climate collapse and dwindling bee populations and all the sort of cascading effects and the consequences that it has on our world, from food chains to species and so on and on. But in any case, she approaches it with anthropological, but also very sensitive spiritual angle, I would say, in the sense that she asks questions that, that people who are, in this sense, many of them come already with ideas about the end of the world, that is like Qiyamah, the end times, in the Muslim tradition. So it's really something, I think, unique, and is going to stand out in how we think about places that are affected by not just conflict and politics, but by a rapidly changing environment and the ways that people make sense or don't make sense of it. So those
Ama-
would be the things that I plug.
Yeah, no, amazing. I really had my eye on the Bosnian study ones. Definitely gonna get that one, and I think I heard of the beekeeping one, but I'm not sure. But that sounds right up my alley of things that I want to
Yeah, it's,
definitely read and explore, and maybe have her. You said this woman, have
yeah,
her on.
yes, Larisa Jasarevic. Yeah,
Let's see. Okay, yeah, definitely something's gonna be on my radar. Okay, well, all that's left, Edin, is to thank you a lot for your time. This was a fantastic conversation. I'm sure listeners would agree. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any final thoughts. Go for it. Otherwise,
No, I mean,
thanks a lot.
my final thought is that like I'm a huge fan of your podcasts, and everyone should listen more of it. I think the conversations, including the recent conversation on Syria and Ukraine
Mm,
alone, would be, I think, a fantastic introduction to the kinds of issues that you like to talk about. Uh, so yeah,
amazing, amazing. Well, thanks a lot, Edin.
okay, thank you, Joey.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.